everybody. Afternoon keynote speaker, Tiffany Cabán. And you may all know Attorney Cabán from this summer's Queens County District Attorney race. I know Attorney Cabán by her profiles in courage from some of my favorite periodicals. And that's because she embodies the legacy and the message of so many movements that are important to what our theme is here today, from the Seneca Falls movement to La Raza Unida, to the Cohambi River Collective, and in the spirit of Chichi Jimenez. She embodies that sirven y proteja a su gente, that spirit of serving one another. And it is my distinct pleasure to give her the warmest of a Vermont Law School welcome. Presente, Attorney Cabán. Thank you.
What's up, y'all? First of all, I just want to say thank you to the law school and the Black Students Law Association, everybody else that put this together. It's really a privilege and an honor to be able to chat with y'all. And I also do want to say that I'd like to spend more time having a conversation with you. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, but I'm really looking forward to taking your questions and engaging in a dialogue. And I'm going to go off script a little bit here. I know that this is the race and law conference, but I kind of want to widen that a little bit. And let's talk about race, law, and movement. And certainly when we talk about movement, we're talking about people, right? That's what's at the center of movement. And when we talk about people, we talk about stories. So I just want to start by telling you a little bit of my story. So for those of you that aren't as familiar, my name is Tiffany Cabán. I am a career public defender who ran for Queens District Attorney, and that's a borough of 2.5 million people, literally the most diverse county in our country. It would be the 4th largest city in our country if it were its own city. And it's certainly something that I never thought that I would do. Running for office didn't seem like it was within the realm of possibilities. Certainly not running for district attorney. Like I said, I'm a career public defender. So when I talk about being a public defender, I talk about it the same way I say that I am a queer woman, I am a Latina, I am a public defender. It is that tied to my identity. And like most people who come to trauma work, because I think public defense is trauma work, just like being a teacher or a doctor or a nurse, it's your own trauma that brings you there. And so a little bit about how I grew up. My grandparents came here from Puerto Rico, and my parents grew up in public housing. My dad is a retired elevator mechanic. My mom, she took care of other people's kids. And I went on to law school. I went on to law school knowing that I wanted to be a public defender, which is really interesting because you go to law school, and I don't know if anybody here is familiar with this, but you tell them you want to be a public defender, and everybody tries to convince you that actually what you want to be is the district attorney, which I just find entirely fascinating. But I became a public defender for a few reasons. I think the first time I really started to zoom out and see the system for what it was when I went to high school. Growing up in the community that I did, I went to a public elementary school and junior high school, most of the kids on assisted lunch, watching kids get suspended on a regular basis, people fighting to keep their homes, people struggling, and certainly within my own home, struggling with varying degrees of exposure to violence, mental health issues, substance use disorder issues, and then, because my dad had a union job, he sent me to a private Catholic high school. And so I took a couple buses over an hour to get to my high school in this much whiter, much wealthier community. And for me, it really started to click that when my community was in crisis, when we needed help, nothing happened. And then eventually what the government did is they sent cops, right? And in other communities, when they needed help, they got access to all of these resources and stabilizing supports. And also what ties into my story is my grandfather. He's a large reason why I do what I do. And I tell the story because I think in a nutshell, it really captures what's wrong, inherently wrong with our system. My grandfather is somebody who was incredibly physically abusive. He was an alcoholic to the point where my grandmother left him. My mom dropped out of high school to help take care of the family, and years later, my mother let him back into our lives so that he could get to know his grandchildren and and his grandchildren could get to know their grandfather. And at that point, he was dying. He was essentially drinking himself to death. But the man that I got to know and experience, like, I loved him. Like, I loved him so much. He was patient and funny and kind. He'd play the guitar for me. He'd tell me he lost part of his ear because he's a combat vet. And he would tell me these, like, fantastical, not war stories, but these stories about how he lost his ear, like witches, wizards, and, like, I just hung on his every word. And as an adult, thinking back on that, I think about the fact that, like, this really abusive husband and father who hurt his family in some significant ways, and this incredible, loving, patient grandfather, they were both so equally true, right? And he was somebody who could have been cycling in and out of our criminal legal system, but ours was a system that didn't take into account the fact that he was a dirt poor kid from Puerto Rico who, served in the Korean War, came back with PTSD, self-medicated with alcohol, and where were our systems in place to support him so that he could support his family, right? And, like, what makes it clear to me is that ours is a system that isn't and shouldn't be about good people and bad people. We just need to lock up the bad people, but it's just about people at the core of it, and trauma, and recognizing how my grandfather's story and experiences, that's intergenerational, and so it affects me as a human being. So I became a public defender, right? But, like, let's be clear, there is very little on any given day that separated me from my clients. The only thing that I can point to is the simple fact that my father got a union job, right? Because what that afforded me was access to health care, to an education, and probably most important to me as an adult, access to therapy so that I could have reparative experiences around my own trauma. And also having the luck of having, like, really incredibly patient and kind partners who held that for me and helped me work through a lot of those things. But, certainly what was modeled for my mother were really unhealthy partnerships and dynamics. And so what did she find in her own relationship and building her family? Really unhealthy dynamics, and that was what was modeled for me. So but for some of those supports, I would be in a very, very different place. And again, these are things that our system doesn't really think too much about. We talk a lot about statistics and trends, but we don't really center it in human lives and how that affects families and communities, not just on the day-to-day basis, but again, intergenerationally. So went on to be a public defender, did that for 7 years, representing over 1,000 clients, everything from turnstile jumps to homicides, right? Like, representing folks that on any given day were in our jail, Rikers Island, simply because they were too poor to afford bail. They struggled with substance use issues or mental health issues. And, like, every single day, literally affirming the fact that our criminal legal system is literally the most powerful driver of the continued oppression of our Black and brown, our low income, our immigrant, our LGBTQIA+ communities. And, we were in a place and time where people were talking about progressive prosecution, right? Like, I had followed Larry Krasner's race really closely, certainly a lot of the other races, like, Rachel Rollins and Wesley Bell and all of those folks. And by that point, probably in, like, the third cycle of these so-called progressive prosecutors races. So the playbook was out there, and I practiced in Manhattan, and DA Vance, he would put out these so-called progressive policies, and literally the next day, he said, hey, I'm not gonna prosecute turnstile jumps anymore, for example. And literally the next day, I picked up a turnstile jump that I litigated for a year and went to trial on, right? And so seeing consistently that my clients were always the exception to the rule, and that these policies were not having intended impacts. And so that was a large reason why I decided to run. It really, in a lot of ways, felt like the right moment and a continuation of my work as a public defender, because real talk, right? Like, again, as a queer Latina from a low-income community, I didn't think that I can go into a DA's office as an assistant DA and do anything other than harm my community rather than help it. But I saw what was happening around the country. And then also, I don't know how closely y'all followed some of the stuff that was happening in Queens, but there were some really incredible things happening politically and electorally in Queens, so it was kind of like the perfect storm. You had the progressive prosecution movement, but at the same time, we had just elected Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Some of the other things that we did locally, we had really thrown out of the legislature a bunch of so-called Democrats and replaced them with true blue Democrats that were going to push progressive policies. And these were races that people didn't think that we could win. Amazon was threatening to come into our communities and displace a lot of folks, and our communities rose and made sure that that didn't happen. And so politically, I jumped into the race not thinking that I could win, but certainly just wanting to hold people's feet to the fire, put it bluntly, to call people out on their bullshit, right? And like center the experiences of my clients. And that's what we did. And it was, looking back on it now, I am so proud of what we built and what we accomplished, because it's still something that's sustainable and that we're still continuing to build. And when I look at how and why we did that and in the process, people think that my race really took off when AOC endorsed, when the New York Times endorsed us, when Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren endorsed us, but like, that is not true. By that point it helped, like, don't get me wrong. But like by that point, right, we had hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. We had this beautiful coalition, like a few weeks, like maybe even almost over a month before that. It was probably one of the most powerful experiences I had on the campaign was a day that we rallied with some folks that recently endorsed, and it was like the most beautiful, powerful thing I had ever experienced, standing alongside formerly incarcerated folks, sex workers, undocumented immigrants, all coming together to say that they were supporting a district attorney's candidate. It was special. It was transformative. It was the very people that have been oppressed and marginalized by our system coming out and saying, like, we believe in the kind of transformative changes that we could have in a race like this. So we went from being an unknown public defender, no resources, no fancy consultants, no money, up against an entrenched political machine. I mean, we're talking about a place where they had handpicked their candidate behind closed doors a year in advance, put $1 million in her war chest and said, okay, go have at it. And in a borough of 2.5 million people, we came up short after a recount by 55 votes, which ended up being a margin of 0.06 of 1%. It's pretty incredible. We got more votes, but that's another story. But like, how do we do that, right? Like, how do we get there? It's because of exactly the kind of change that we were fighting for. People called my platform radical, but those are people that really didn't have any personal connection to the system, because when I talked to other public defenders, other practitioners, when I talked to directly impacted folks, they knew that this was common sense. They knew that what these policies did was create an understanding in systems that acknowledge the fact that stability equals public safety, right? This idea that when you know where you're gonna lay your head down at night, have access to health care, mental health services, harm reduction services, trauma-informed services, that is the best way to keep our community safe. That we could be reallocating our resources, for example, to target and hold accountable folks that are destabilizing entire communities. So instead of criminalizing poverty, mental health, substance use, we could be prosecuting landlords who are unlawfully evicting, doctors who are overprescribing opioids, employers who are stealing wages, knowing that these folks, the harm that they're causing, destabilize entire communities, and that the result is creating an environment where there are opportunities for not just low-level nonviolent crime, but violent crime as well, right? And so understanding, like, and redefining what the role of the office was, and saying, it's public safety, it's not punishment for the sake of punishing. And the one thing that our system doesn't do and conflates is it conflates accountability with punishment. And punishment does nothing to change behavior. And so saying we are gonna take the stand and make it clear that our goal are the best public health and best public safety outcomes, and more often than not, that means non-system interventions. So we were running on this sort of crazy idea that, like, we wanted to divest from the system. We wanted to have a little less power. We wanted to redefine what public safety was, what the role was, and say that if we're gonna invest in communities, that means investing in ways that don't require you to put money into programs that you can only access after the police get involved. That's not a community investment, right? That those need to be coming up front. And that really resonated, and that's how we built our power, built our coalition base. And the beautiful thing is that they're still organizing around that. And sort of the last thing I want to leave y'all with before I just take questions is that, one, it was the power of the law and my legal education that helped me get to this point, but it was also the power of being in community and taking the things that I could offer to community to expand their capacity and have them lead. Because, like, real talk, the way that my policy platform came to be is I literally sat on my couch and wrote them down, right, to start. And every single policy had a client's face and a family attached to it. And then from there, I went to the community groups or organizations that were doing the work around those issues. So I went to, we have groups like that are called Vocal New York that do things with harm reduction and housing and work with formerly incarcerated folks, or Make the Road that work with our TGNC communities, or our trans and gender non-conforming folks, our immigrant communities, and they help tighten up the policies, and we got our messaging in line. And then after that, I went to the academics around the country. So it was last that I went to the John Pfaffs of the world to talk about treating violence as a public health issue, or Leo Beletsky to talk about harm reduction. And the amazing thing about that is that, one, when you start it that way, because it's really inverse of how things are done, but I think it's the way it should be done, the really amazing thing is that it all lines up. Like, you talk to people's experiences, they know exactly what they need, how to message it to their communities. And then the amazing thing is that you go up to the academics and they're like, yeah, all the studies and the stuff, it supports that. And so really, again, kind of redefining the way that we go about engaging with our communities, making sure that it's not in a paternalistic manner, making sure that we are allowing folks to lead with their experience, to lead with love and strength. And it just proved to me that even when you lose, you win. Again, because we've built this strong coalition, and there's so many more people in relationship ready to hold the current DA accountable and to push on these issues in our legislatures. But also, I have, like, the beautiful, beautiful opportunity to now be doing national political organizing with the Working Families Party, literally getting to scale the organizing model we used in Queens and our message on our platform, and doing that narrative shift, that culture shift that I think is required to really change our system. On a national scale. Like, we're doing that and getting into communities all around the country to make sure that we are electing not just progressive DAs, but decarceral DAs. And more folks to give some allies to DA Sarah George over here. But I just want to thank y'all for listening to my story. It's been an honor to share it with you. And I'd love to be able to take your questions. So thank you. Yes.
Good afternoon, Tiffany. I too am a former public defender, still do criminal defense. So I have to ask, how was it for you to run as a criminal defense attorney, a public defender, a career, passionate public defender? And I agree with your assessment of this trauma work. How was that received by the populace to be the chief prosecuting officer in the borough of Queens?
So I was very clear from the outset that doing this, one, the beauty of doing it the way that we did it and not thinking that you were going to win is, and again, excuse my language, but, like, I had the privilege of giving zero fucks. Like, we were not going to change for anyone. I felt accountable to my client. Like, the beautiful thing about being a public defender, which I think sometimes is different in a lot of the culture in DA's offices, is that, like, there's a real understanding that your clients come first always, right? Like, it is your clients first, then your colleagues, then your bosses. And so the only way that I can engage in this process is if I felt like what I was doing was actually putting my clients first and recognizing very clearly that this was harm reduction. So when I think about what we're doing, I again take a step back and think about it in terms of movement and movement ecology and, like, the inside and outside game and all of the pieces that have to fit together to bring transformation. And I thought about it as being able to reduce harm and create pathways for others to further dismantle systems, right? By sharing information, by opening doors. And, most folks were incredibly supportive. There's a gentleman that's going to be on a panel later today, Anton Robinson. He was with Vera, and before he was with Vera, he was my colleague He was a public defender in the office I was in, and he was one of the very many people that were super excited for me and supportive. And then there are also some folks on the other side that'll be like, no, we're public defenders, and like you just don't do that. And the response that I have to that is like, that's fair, and I think that again, when we look at movement ecologies, there's a really important space and lane for those folks to hold and push back in that way. But I will say this: for every public defender that says that if you're not a public defender if you go do this thing, there are also outside activists and organizers and abolitionists that are saying, actually, public defenders aren't it either because y'all are propping up the system. Like what we as public defenders don't always like to admit is that we're part of the inside game. And so we legitimize this system that also we're battling. And so like, being able to take that look back and say, well, this is the role I'm playing, and this is the role that other folks are playing, and these folks, and as long as we remain in relationship with one another, hold each other accountable, and have respect for the work that we're doing, but challenge one another, then that is how we get change to happen over time. Yeah.
What a breath of fresh air you are.
Well, thank you. Yes.
So what's the challenge? Thank you. So what's the challenge for women to do this job that you facing when you're starting, and how did you overcome those challenges?
You know, what's really interesting is that the biggest challenge, at least when running for office and talking to folks about our vision and the things that we wanted to do, was literally time and resources. So when I announced in my race in early January, literally less than a week later, our legislature passed laws, so that the primary went from being a September primary to a June primary. So like all of a sudden we were like, oh, we got 6 months to do this, and again, in a borough of 2.5 million people. So for us, it was literally like, will we get in front of enough people in time? Because if we do, we will win. Like the amazing thing is that the demographics there it runs the gamut from very progressive to very conservative, and no matter who we were talking to and in front of, our message resonated. You know, I remember being out in a neighborhood that like folks said, well, these aren't your voters. And the thing with electoral work is, right, that you have limited time, and so really you are looking for your people and then making sure you drive your people out. There's not as much of an opportunity to do persuasion work, which is what we should be doing year round, right? But going to some of these places and literally I remember I was at a train station, and somebody giving out my literature, and somebody was like, oh no, I'm not taking that. I don't think we agree on the issues. And he walks like half a block, and then he comes back and he's like, actually, I want to talk to you. And we started having a conversation, and by the end of it, he was like, oh, like this makes sense. Because the reality is that our system actually isn't set up to optimize public safety outcomes. What it does is really create the conditions to make sure that people stay in crisis, stay destabilized, and touch the system again. And so a lot of the common ground when I talked about things like harm reduction or decriminalizing sex work, right, leading with what do we want? We want the best public health and public safety outcomes. Well, what we're doing now doesn't get us there, and so let's talk about what would get us there, and finding that common ground and really finding that to be a really powerful way to bring more people in that like you wouldn't think would be brought in. The other thing too is that our system has created this like entirely false binary, right? Where, you know, people want to attack what we're doing and say, but then you can't center victims and survivors. And that is just not a fact. It's not true. Our system was not set up to make survivors whole, and it was not set up to make sure that other folks aren't harmed in the same way. You know, it's interesting because we give victims and survivors, which often, the other thing too is the intersectionality of it all, right? Like when you're practicing, you know that it's something we commonly say, like as a defense attorney, one week this person is my client, next week they're the witness in a case, and you know, the week after that they're the victim or survivor or the complainant in a case, and like having to understand how that works within a community. But we give folks two choices. Either we say, you do nothing, right? Because you don't want somebody to end up in a jail, and the harm never gets addressed, or the only thing that we can do for you is put this person into a cage, and by the way, 97, 98% of the time they're going to re-enter their communities with no guarantees that we've done anything to change behavior, right? So we have a program actually that DA Eric Gonzalez participates in that I think is really incredible, and it's called Common Justice. And what they do is they give survivors and victims of violent crime another option. And when given that option, 97% of the time they choose it. And so they engage in restorative justice, putting survivors and victims together with the people who harm them, and having conversations about what they need to be made whole. Because when you ask survivors and victims what they want more than anything, the number one thing, overwhelmingly, is not punishment. It's, I want to make sure that I can be whole again, that I can heal, and that nobody else gets hurt the same way that I have been hurt. And incarceration does nothing to address that, so we need to also invest in those who harm to serve survivors. And the outcomes with those kinds of cases has been incredible. What they're finding is that almost all of the participants in the programs, they go on not to reoffend in significant ways. So these things work. So really, we are sitting in a system where we kind of put out into the press, into our spaces, these tropes and strategies that are being used that provide the optics of safety for white and wealthy communities, literally at the expense of actual safety, especially also from state-sanctioned violence, of our Black and brown and poor communities. And so really getting that conversation out in front of folks, and saying, like, well, what do you want? Do you want to maybe think that you're safe, or do we want to create the kinds of communities that foster and ensure health and safety, and also calling out the system on some of its bullshit, because they'll say, well, some of the opposition will say, for an example that was used in Queens, is like, well, we still have a problem with sexual assaults in the borough. And yeah, it's a problem. About 40% of sexual assault cases don't get resolved, right? There's nobody that's held accountable. There's no process there. And they want to say that the answer is more policing, more incarceration, but really the reality is that it's a failure also of law enforcement and DA's offices in the way that they use their resources, because the amount of time spent and resources spent policing and criminalizing public health issues means resources taken away from being able to have and hold folks accountable for more serious crimes. And so, like, shifting narratives too is really important, in understanding actually where the failures in our system are. I think was a challenge, but it's something that is becoming more readily available in part of the narrative. Yes. Oh.
Okay. Hi, Tiffany. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? Wait,
Good.
where are you at?
Yeah. So just coming from the type of community you come from, I can kind of relate in a sense. How did you get the people from the communities on board with just sort of the platform or the movement in terms of the direction that you were trying to go in? Because I think when you come from certain communities, sometimes that's a challenge in a sense, trying to organize and have them buy into the vision. What were some of your tactics that you used?
Before I decided to run for office, I had never done electoral work. Like, it was a crash course. But I think the one big thing is, especially as my experience as a brown queer woman, right? Like, you go through spaces with imposter syndrome. Like, it took a long time for me to reframe that I was where I was, not because I was faking it till I made it, but because I was exceptional, right? Like not even just baseline, I belong there, but because I was exceptional. I had a hard time moving through spaces that weren't built for me. And I experienced that in high school, going to an overwhelmingly white, wealthier school, the same with undergrad, and then certainly in law school. And I struggled with that for a long time, but therapy is great. And so like being able to reframe, and I also want to engage in that process with like anybody else that I come across to be like, no, you are here, you belong here, you are exceptional, you can do these things. And really these systems and structures are made up in a way to mystify it and say like, no, you can't do this. And I'll tell you what, being in the spaces I am in right now, like, and I'm not just talking about in the campaign space, but having the relationships that I do with elected officials and legislators and all these folks, there are a lot of mediocre white men holding these positions where you're like, damn, we could do this. We should be doing this. So I think that, you know, to directly answer your question, though, is like, it wasn't that hard because the relationships were there and I was listening, right? Like, for me, a lot of what I talked about was informed by my personal experiences as like a directly impacted person myself, and then also my experience with my clients. But understanding that what my role was like I was a vessel. My job was to amplify what it was that the folks in my community who were most deeply and directly impacted by our criminal legal system were dealing with. And when you go to folks and you're there to listen and you mirror their messages out, or you amplify their voices, and you go to them and be like, this is how I think about it. How can I be better? How can we make sure we're in alignment? Am I doing this justice? Folks just flock to it. I mean, we built something really, really beautiful. Like I said, not just the diversity of the coalition, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of volunteers on GOTV weekend, so Get Out the Vote weekend. We knocked over 150,000 doors. Like, that is some real people power. And that is just, again, what drives that, what does that is you allow folks to take ownership over what you're trying to build. There's a real co-governance element that's involved in that. They feel really invested. And that's how we win these races and continue this, because establishment vote, in my mind, is capped. Right? And so we know that there's a limited number of votes going out for the triple prime voters, for the folks that are sort of status quo. And what we want to do is we want to expand the electorate. We want to get people out who have become disillusioned with our electoral process, saying that, like, well, it doesn't make a difference. We don't get the changes we want to see, and give them something that makes them invested in and excited enough to go out and bring everybody they know to go out and to build the relationships they need to be powerful organizers and leaders in their communities. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for coming. My question is,
Having me.
My question is this, and I want to get your thoughts on this as a public defender. Since over the past few years, there have been a number of progressive elected prosecutors all over the country, and the interesting thing to observe, or I've observed, is that there's been intense pushback, one of which comes from law enforcement itself, and then the other comes from the higher-ups, meaning at the state level through the governors or the legislatures. And prosecutors are famed for having their discretion to decide how to charge, and they're celebrated for that. But in these cases of these kinds of prosecutors, now there's real pushback. Like, for example, a few years ago, Florida elected a state's attorney in the Orlando metro area, and she came in office opposed to the death penalty, and she just said, I'm not going to bring death penalty cases. And then Governor Scott, now Senator Scott, tried to remove her from office. In an infamous note, Attorney General Barr had some really harsh positions about how he felt about these new wave of prosecutors that were elected. And I think even in Texas right now, there's a bill being floated to wrest control of locally elected prosecutors in like the major metro areas, and have them be appointed by the state, which is a Republican-dominated one. Meanwhile, the prosecutors in the rural areas of Texas would, of course, be elected through local control. So I would love to get your response to these kinds of phenomena with this kind of pushback, and how could others who have the similar view of like criminal justice reform, restorative justice, how can they push back, and what's a good way to manage that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I probably am going to jump all over the place, and also, like, forgive me for putting on like my super nerdy organizing hat on. But one, I think that there's I think it's important to name that there is inherently a difference in my mind between progressive, quote unquote, progressive prosecutors and decarceral prosecutors. And in terms of the pushback, I think we have to be really, really clear about where it comes from, right? Like on a larger scale, we are talking about threatening white supremacy, right? Like we are talking about threatening systems that have been used to oppress. Like we need to name this more often, that what we are talking about is divesting from a system that has directly grown out of slavery. From slavery to the black codes, to convict leasing, to stop and frisk, to broken windows policing, to like what we are dealing with right now. It is all very connected. And when you are threatening those kinds of things, there are gonna be people and institutions that push back. And also, we're talking about a billion-dollar money-making business, right? Like literally making billions of dollars off of breaking black and brown bodies, right? And like putting it in that context and naming it and making people really uncomfortable so that we're having those conversations. And then aside from that, how do we support these folks that are trying to do good work, that are uplifting and doing the work of representing the people who are most marginalized and don't have access to political power, right? And we're trying to change that. I think also if we enfranchise folks, we change entire electorates and we can turn any election up and down the ballot, is my opinion. But when we're trying to protect and support these district attorneys that are engaging in meaningful, powerful harm reduction, it comes from protecting them from all kinds of avenues, and that's where the organizing model earlier that I talked about, so that when the NYPDs come or when the police departments come for them and these other folks, well, we have community groups engaged in direct actions, like showing up in force and in numbers, saying like, no, we have a mandate, like and also we're going to vote these people out of office to make sure that we have other elected officials around that are supporting these things. Because the one thing I will say is that this quote unquote progressive prosecutor movement, it will fail if we do not also invest the time, energy, and resources to making sure that we are building the kind of public health infrastructure alongside it that can create the kinds of communities that make sure that we are achieving the best public health and public safety outcomes. Without those things, and like when you look at the opposition, they're fighting to make sure we don't get those things, to ensure the failure of the work that we're doing. And so taking out that broader lens and understanding that like our movement in terms of criminal legal reform, we don't do it without engaging and being in relationship with folks that are doing housing work, that are doing healthcare work, that are doing education work, that we need to coalition build and recognize that they're all so deeply intertwined. Like I don't see this as we are trying to fix a system. I see it as a multi-generational project towards getting rid of a system, not even replacing it, right? But building the kinds of communities with the access to the things that we need to survive and thrive that don't ever have to rely on the caging and stripping of humanity and dignity of another human being. And it's a worthwhile goal.
Thank you, Tiffany. It is a delight to have you here. I can't tell you how happy I am to hear you and meet you. But criminal justice reform, in addition to every other major public policy challenge we face, healthcare, student debt, on and on and on, trying to change those things all are opposed by people who have vast resources and want to maintain a status quo. And as someone who's run for office, and I hope you run again, what do we do about money in politics?
So I think that we're seeing like a sea change in terms of that. And again, the easiest example is obviously Alexandria, but like even the way we see how presidential campaigns are running their campaigns, it is not about the air game anymore. Like it's not about the TV ads and the mailers, which are all like incredibly expensive, but we are out organizing folks. We're saying boots on the ground. And so again, going into like a very into the weeds thing, but in any given election, for example, the general rule is that you want to get 7 to 8 touches to ensure that person goes out to the polls and votes for you, right? But the other thing that we take into the mix is that like a person at a door talking face to face with somebody is worth 3 or 4 touches in and of itself and costs a lot less. And when you're building grassroots movements, they're your best messengers because they're very, very invested in what you're fighting for. So it's really, really powerful. So I think, as we continue to do that, and then we have more people saying, hey, we're taking these pledges not to take real estate money, not to take corporate money, not to take PAC money, not to take fossil fuel money. And I believe anyway that it's really catching on, and we're seeing it happen more and more in places that also you might not think. So like, when I think about DA's races, which is now my job all of the time, I don't even want to look, I generally don't look at the big cities first. One, because we're expected to win in those places, and then when we don't, it's weaponized against us. But those are also often the very places that have the kinds of money to like really push out the wrong narratives and like buy shit. But there are a lot of different places that you might not think that are ready for this change, that have powerful like community organizations that are engaging in direct services and are what we go in and do and say, hey, we want to add another tool to your toolbox. We want to help you engage in electoral work and build a new lane for, have a new way of building some power. And when we have more of these wins in places that you might not think, I think it's going to really send the message that this is a mandate around the country. Like there are some very powerful, privileged, moneyed voices that are saying one thing, but what I've learned from traveling more and more around the country is that overwhelmingly our communities are saying something very different. Cool. He's got a lot of money. When I don't think that, what I was talking to somebody about this recently, but I think part of the reason why also some people don't see him as big of a threat as I think he actually is, and threat I mean in terms of the dangerousness in the way we engage in politics, is because people actually, you can't, so there was a scientist that did this study that there are like certain things that your brain can't compute or comprehend or like picture, and once you get into that level of billions of dollars, it means nothing to your brain. You can't, like people don't think about the fact that Tom Steyer is a billionaire, right? But like Bloomberg has billions and billions and billions and billions and billions on top of his billions. We're talking about, in comparison, Tom Steyer would be below the poverty line, and Mike Bloomberg would be like, and that's not even like we just can't comprehend it. And to see what money can do in politics is a little scary. So that's why I think the focus needs to be on boots on the ground organizing and really relational organizing, relationships, and getting people invested in things. Because quite frankly, he's spending a lot of money in this race, and honestly, probably not spending as much as he could so that people aren't thinking about the fact that like you can completely buy elections, and what kind of response that would elicit in our communities or around our country. But yeah, I don't think he'll be elected, and that'll be a good thing. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.